Welcome back to the Quantum Connection podcast. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm your host, Vanessa Baldwin, and we also have, of course, my co-host, Heather Crimson. And today we have an amazing guest. His name is Tim Hammond. And I met Tim, actually, we were in the same cohort from the Quantum Biology Collective. And Tim, I was saying to Heather before you got on that you would always ask like the most intelligent scientific questions. I'm like, oh, he's guy's smart. He knows a lot. Like you really formulated really great questions. That would get our coaches and practitioners who were guiding us like really thinking. So that was awesome. So I was drawn to you for that reason. So he's also a graduate from the Quantum Biology Collective. So he's a practitioner and helps people, support their health through this quantum biology lens. And he actually is a former intelligence analyst, excuse me, that I didn't know about. So that's pretty cool background that you have there. So, and he's also the founder of his own company, Regenerate. So welcome, Tim. Thank you so much for being here. We're excited to have you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Awesome. So Tim, why don't you just start with like sharing, your story? Like, of course, you always want to know, well, what brought you to quantum biology and learning these practices and principles?
Yeah. Well, for many of us, I assume it was a bit of a long journey with my own chronic health issues. So I had a 10-year previous career as an intelligence analyst, as you mentioned, and disinformation investigator. And throughout that journey, I would be working really hard at my job and succeeding. I was happy about that. However, I was always experiencing these persistent health crashes that were always unexplainable. And I started really develop them since middle school. And doctors would often just explain, oh, you're just depressed, or provide different labels for that explains groups of symptoms, but not explanation of any cause. Things like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, things of that nature. As I got older, the crashes started becoming more severe and lasting longer, and were a lot more difficult to kind of pick myself up out of. So I discovered in 2017 that I had Lyme disease, and I was somewhat lucky enough to be able to be diagnosed with that through the CDC criteria. So a lot of people are somewhat uncertain if they have Lyme or not because the testing is so poor. In most cases, it's less than 30% accurate. So I was one of these cases where it was a very clear indication that yes, I had chronic and ongoing infections of Lyme, and discovered that I had multiple complicating co-infections, such as babesiosis, which is a malaria-like parasite that when you have that in conjunction with Lyme, which is a spirochete bacteria, it can really make treating this disease a lot more complicated and difficult. So we can get into the complications of Lyme and all the co-infections because that really matters and is what makes the disease so complex. But so starting in 2017, then I went down as many different routes as you can kind of imagine trying to figure it out. And as an intelligence analyst, I was very focused on really understanding the root causes of things and understanding the triggers, but everything seemed so moving targets, shifting symptoms. And I think anybody who's experienced Lyme or similar conditions will understand what I mean when I say that. So I started out mostly through a pharmaceutical approach, and that stirred up a lot worse symptoms because for most people, when you start treating Lyme disease, you trigger what's called a Herxheimer's reaction. So the die-off of these bacteria and the release of these endotoxins will create an increase in the symptoms that you typically are already feeling, and it'll feel much worse. And it's kind of like peeling off layers of an onion. If you kind of get one layer of the disease treated, you're digging deeper and releasing biofilm, and a lot of pathogens that are kind of inactive in the biofilm are released, and then that activates more. So I started feeling incredibly sick. It was very difficult to be able to get through work or anything of that nature. I ended up being on about 50 pills a day, including pharmaceutical medications, many, many antibiotics, many different biofilm dissolvers, and also different herbal treatments, until it got to the point where I wasn't sure if I was going to survive just because it seemed so bad. So I was really trying to white knuckle it through that treatment and be able to complete it and finish it. But I just wasn't able to. And so I quit all of the antibiotic treatment and shifted towards herbal protocols. Things
So,
like,
so sorry to interrupt you, Tim. It sounds like you were utilizing allopathic, conventional, and alternative options, right? A whole combination.
I I was using a combination. In the beginning, it was mostly focused on pharmaceutical,
Okay.
but because that seemed like a nuclear option, I really shifted away from that because I understood, well, there's trillions of these different types of pathogens that exist in our environment.
Yeah.
So why is it that my immune system in my body is incapable of having a balanced ecosystem?
Mhm.
And I was very clear in understanding that by using this nuclear option of antibiotics, I was just bombing all of the microbiome in my own gut that is responsible for the majority of my own immune system. So it seemed like this nuclear option that was just blowing everything up when what I really needed was more of a tactical way of getting in there and keeping healthy microbiome alive, because that was ultimately what was going to provide long lasting immune support. So it just wasn't making sense to me anymore. Um, I do think that in many cases with Lyme, antibiotic treatment is absolutely necessary, especially for people who have severe carditis and heart complications from it. Um, so I shifted to more naturopathic types of treatments and protocols. But in shifting from pharmaceutical model to naturopathic model, what I found was they were all using the same mentality of what external things from the outside, be it antibiotics or supplements, can we just keep throwing at the body rather
Yes.
than understanding.
Yes. Yes, I don't want to do either, but I'm so glad you say it, because a lot of us think, oh, we're going to the alternative world, we're going to the naturopathic world, the functional medicine world. It's really different, but it's really the same approach. Is like
Mhm.
that, like it's really doing this. It's really the same kill protocol. Instead of strengthening the body, instead of looking at it from a mitochondria standpoint, a circadian biology standpoint, we use homeopathy. So that kind of standpoint, all of that is really just about strengthening your immune system and getting you stronger, building your redox. So these pathogens you're not susceptible anymore. They're not getting into the cell. That's the point. So if we can
Mhm.
build that resilience, right, that's where I know the story is going to get better. Like that's where things improve, right?
Exactly. And I'm glad you say that, because I think the reason that I was experiencing such difficult Herxheimer's reactions from treatment is because I did not have strong enough redox potential.
Right.
So, and,
Exactly.
and my detox pathways were not open enough. So I'm just basically stirring up the hornet's nest and my body's not able to efficiently eliminate. So in the quantum space, we often say redox before detox, or at least be doing those both in conjunction. I really wasn't consistently applying anything in the quantum space in terms of grounding, infrared sunlight exposure, fixing circadian rhythms, so that my body had sufficient charge and exclusion zone water to be able to push things out, kind of have a protective barrier around my cells so that intracellular pathogens can't even get in. So had I applied that with doing the allopathic treatments, I'm sure things would have gone much more smoothly. But that being said, it's a tricky case with everybody. For some people, they're gonna require more of antibiotics. Some people with herbal protocols are okay. But I really found that, like we're saying, both of these approaches are really thinking under the same paradigm and not looking at the body. How does our body work? How did we evolve? And how does the environment that we're in trigger the epigenetic changes that turn on and off genes that allow us to either be healthy and experience health and regeneration, or the manifestation of disease?
Mhm.
And I really started learning that lesson when I kind of retreated. It was then pandemic time. I spent most of the time out in nature, all summer long. I was barefoot outside in the sun, gardening. I took up an interest in regenerative agriculture, especially because I felt like glyphosate was such a huge part of my issue as well, as it
Yeah.
destroys the gut lining, makes hyperpermeability, and allows so many undigested food particles and or pathogens enter the bloodstream. And so you end up having an autoimmune type of reaction. So I believe that was the reason when early on I did many tests and they would show that I had, quote unquote, allergies or intolerances to pretty much every food you can imagine. And the initial, same
Yeah,
with
yeah,
you?
yeah. Oh, me too. Yeah, yeah, 100%. It was like you go to do the food sensitivity test. You're like, well, you can eat what I think, Heather, you said just beef, right? Like that was the one thing you could eat, right? Like, so literally we both have been down the diet rabbit holes things, and you're like, that's never going to work either. Like just eliminating all the foods, like you need diversity. You need to make your body stronger. So go ahead.
Because I went
Exactly.
to an integrative MD, Tim, and she was a great lady, but she didn't know what to do with that, right? So what do you do when this test is literally null and void because that's not helpful? Well, how is that
Mhm.
helpful when you can't, you're sensitive to everything. Okay, great. Now what? I did 3 rounds with the highest quality nutraceuticals or whatever you call them of, trying to use the herbal, antimicrobials and all that. And then you're going to repopulate and all those things. And none of it worked.
Yeah.
None of it worked.
Did you initially try just elimination diets like they usually suggest?
Yeah, I was just eating
Mhm.
basically beef. Well, I'd started carnivore a long time ago in 2010 and 11 before I think most people had even heard about it. And that helped, but that's not a way to live. But then what happened is the histamine issue came along. So then, right, I thought I was doing great by doing bone broth. And so you never really get out of that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I honestly think that the more restrictive I went, the worse I got. Honestly, the more restrictive and the more supplements I took, the worse I felt. And honestly, the more I've been able to, because there's definitely still a little food fear for me that I'm still working on. That's a mindset thing that I'm working on. But honestly, the more that I expand and open my diet, the better it is for me, because the body really needs more diversity. And of course, I do this within seasonal local parameters, right? But the point is, yeah, I don't know. For me, that carnivore was very rough. And
Mhm.
see,
Out doing the gardening and that year you said that summer, had you already discovered quantum biology or were you just doing that instinctively?
mm,
No, I was just doing that instinctively. That's really how I enjoy spending my time. I grew up in a very rural environment, lived in DC for 5 years, working out there, but then moved back. And so it's just where I naturally felt most comfortable and most fueled. But I would experience that in the winter times. My symptoms would really start flaring up again, and my arthritis would get really bad. I eventually became medically disabled, actually, and wasn't able to work at it all anymore, just because things like sitting at a computer would be too uncomfortable, or trying to type was too difficult with kind of the arthritis that I was experiencing, or symptoms like the brain fog and chronic fatigue, the neurological symptoms that come with Lyme. It just became too disabling. So that was very disheartening, and kind of you experience a lot of shame as well when you're dealing with chronic illness, especially if
mhm.
you're very driven and motivated. I was very proud about the work that I had always done. Not that that's necessarily the healthiest thing, but then when that's kind of taken away from you, you start learning that, well, there's the biophysical and chemical aspects of illness, and then there's this whole psychological, mental, even spiritual aspects that you have to start kind of healing all of it and integrating everything together. But
So glad you mentioned that because I think that's a hugely under-recognized piece and even more so in the quantum realm about how our mindset, emotional frame of mind, right? How we see ourselves as a person, like you're saying, you're a very capable person. Now you're so compromised. All of the emotional fallout from that, right, is so devastating for us. And then how does that even affect our functionality as far as the
Our
quantum
electrical
effects?
body, right? Yeah, our emotional and electrical body, it's all connected. And I relate so much to that, Tim, because you don't probably know my story as much, but I also left my career. I was a special ed teacher, and I had to leave my career as well, just because my symptoms were so debilitating as well. And there's a lot when that's been your identity for so long, and that leaving that, and then that financial security, and that's a whole nutshell to deal with in itself. Also part of the healing journey, because moving towards your passion, your purpose, where your life's purpose is, where you're destined to go, which I'm sure you can relate to all of that too. But yeah, I can really relate because my pain and symptoms were too great for me to continue on my job. So yeah.
I think that's a common theme among many of the quantum biology health practitioners or people in similar spaces.
Yeah.
And in some ways, we can look back and be grateful for the experience we went through, because it's the greatest possible teacher we ever could have had. I know that many of the concepts that I've learned, I probably just wouldn't necessarily believe unless I experienced it firsthand. The
Mhm.
largest of which being the detrimental impact of non-native electromagnetic fields. Um, just because that is such a normal part of our day-to-day lives, and on which all of society is dependent. I don't think I necessarily would have believed how damaging it is to the body, unless I experienced it. And that kind of was part of the clue. I mentioned how in the winters I would have these symptom flare-ups again. That's largely because I was spending so much more time indoors, much less sunlight, much less grounding, and I was also on my computer working all day, so exposed to a lot of non-native EMF. And then in situations where I was living for short-term periods next to a 5G tower, my symptoms when I was there were much, much worse. And we can get into the reasons why that is. But after about 3 years of these regular patterns of me noticing, I'm doing better in the summer, I'm outside gardening and growing my own food, eliminating the glyphosate and things like that. And then in the winter kind of crashing, it just made sense that, well, nature is healing. But I really, for my mind, for many people, the kind of faith of that would be enough. And I think that's wonderful. But my mind, I really needed to understand why. And that's what led me into the quantum biology space and starting to study that, to understand the scientific reasons of why light, water, and magnetism are so crucial as the foundations of our biophysical body. And then when we're looking at diet, exercise, all of that, that's really this kind of secondary layer. So kind of getting to first principles. And in my career too, especially as a disinformation investigator, anytime you're dealing with examining a complex problem, it's really helpful to look at that problem through the lens of first principles, which is also a notion in physics. So first principles is the idea of breaking down a complex problem into its most basic components. So quantum biology also from that lens just naturally seemed the most fitting for me. Because the biochemical models, whether it was the pharmaceutical or the nutraceutical, just weren't working for me after pretty much a decade of trying everything I could and beating myself up every time it wasn't working because, you know, I must not be doing something right. But yeah, lost my train of thought there.
Yeah, but I can relate to that too. I did the same thing with the beating yourself up because you think it's your fault. You're like, why didn't the antibiotics work? Why didn't, I had chronic UTI. So why is the antibiotic not taking it away? Well, it must be something I'm doing wrong. It must be, and they do that. Like a lot of times it's blame on you. And even in the functional medicine world, or are you following the diet? Are you, you get those kind of like questions. I'm like, yeah, I'm doing yeah, I'm going to follow your protocol to a T, like given a protocol, that's my personality. And I would follow the protocols given to me 100% and feel like getting worse. And I was like, well, what's wrong with me? What am I doing wrong? Right. We definitely do that.
Vanessa, we need to do a whole episode on the medical gaslighting.
Oh, we really do. We really do. That'd be a great one. Yeah. So Tim, tell us how you're doing now. I'm assuming, how's your health now? You're doing better?
So much better. I mean, the breakthrough has been such a relief, and in some ways so unexpected because you got to a point of such hopelessness. But I think the things that really turned things around for me were fixing my circadian rhythm. Getting up, trying to catch as many sunrises as I can, really prioritizing UVA rise, and then mitigating blue light, artificial blue light at night, really, really important. Focusing on better cellular hydration, which includes the health of the mitochondria, not just the water we drink, but empowering the mitochondria to make more deuterium depleted water through grounding and infrared light exposure and everything like that. And I think all of those kind of quantum applications are what increase my redox potential, are what improve the health of my mitochondria and allowed me to start kind of crawling my way out of this. So I'm doing so much better. I'm so grateful that I'm doing so much better. And it's such a relief to experience a decentralized medical paradigm because I didn't have to get a prescription for sunlight. And I didn't have to pay for a special $10,000 treatment to put my feet on the grass.
And I love that because we make it so complicated. I was making a reel this morning about this. Like we make health and healing so complicated. And I'm sure you feel this, Tim, on your journey. Like I felt this And simplifying things is also another thing that I feel like was so important for me in my own healing journey too, because it was like, I got to see this practitioner, I got to see that practitioner, I got to do this treatment, I got to do that treatment, I got to make sure I get all these things in all day long, right? Like, and the healing becomes so complicated. I used to have a schedule to like when I had to take my supplements, and it wasn't even helping, right? Like, but it was like we make it so complicated, and then I think like we're always looking for, what is that gadget, what is that thing that's going to help us, right? What is that quick fix pill? And like, when we break it down, what we really need is to simplify things and be outside. And like, that's like
Yeah.
those simple things, like get away from the technology, get away from anything artificial, simplify things, be outside, eat real food that you grew. Like, it's just like so basic. So when you say that, people are like, that can't be it. Like, that's not it. That's too easy. Like, I need this device. I need this thing. When I'm like, really, that's not what you need. So,
So
and I love that you say that, because I just want to reiterate that for listeners, because this Lyme is like it's a big thing to heal, right? It's huge. Like, think about where you were to where you are now. And what really moved the needle for you was the simple things.
yeah, and for our readers, Tim, so connect the dots between, okay, you had this severe Lyme, you're debilitated, right? You couldn't work, and then you came across quantum biology. So from a quantum biology scientific standpoint, what exactly happened in your body that changed from these practices that you embraced that allowed your body to get to where you are now and recover to this point?
Well, I think there's a lot of aspects of that. I mean, one, if I can back up just 1 minute, I remember what I lost my train of thought on. I was
Yeah.
explaining the first principles notion, breaking complex problems down into their most basic components. That's why the biochemical models of whether it was pharmaceutical or nutraceutical treatments of just throwing external things at the body wasn't working, because at the level of biochemistry, we're looking at life's interactions at the level of molecules, right? But if we really want to understand our bodies at the more fundamental level, we have to go deeper. We have to go quantum and looking at life at the level of atoms and subatomic particles. So how do electrons move through the body? Because we are bioelectric beings. So I think that, yes, getting sunlight, fixing circadian rhythm, grounding, they sound, just being out in nature sounds like, well, these are such simple things, they couldn't possibly work. But if you actually explore the science behind it and the quantum biology and the quantum physics behind it, there's nothing more beautifully complex. And I think that that's where you can kind of help sell people on these ideas of, they think it's too simple to work. But if they understand some more of the complex mechanisms at play here, of how photons interact with the electrons, how electrons move through the electron transport chain to create our ATP and metabolic water. If they understand that, then it'll make sense. So I think that the education of these mechanisms is really important. Tying back to your question, there's a few categories of things that really help the body. So number one, starting with the light environment, I think is the easiest to feel like you can take control over something and make some environmental changes. So artificial blue light, particularly at night, is incredibly destructive to the body. The reason for this is that in nature, the role of blue light is to rise in the morning. And when that blue light enters your eye, those signals travel through to the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the brain, and they stimulate the release of your stress hormones like cortisol to wake you up and get you going for the day's activities, to increase blood glucose levels. So blue light is a good thing. We need this. But there's a couple aspects of artificial blue light that are damaging. First being the circadian rhythm aspect of it, is your body tells time based on the increasing or decreasing presence of blue light. And this really seems to be an adaptation that is very, very old from an evolutionary perspective, and that life on Earth evolved out of the oceans. And the sunlight gets scattered by the water molecules, and most of the wavelengths of light, such as red and orange and yellow, they are readily absorbed and scattered. But blue is a wavelength of light that is able to penetrate through the depths the most. So in the depths of the ocean, it's a predominantly blue lit environment. So in order for organisms and life forms that were evolving to be able to determine day versus night, and the reason that this was important is because they would have to regulate activities such as feeding, reproduction, and avoiding predators. So to be able to determine whether it was day or night, they needed to evolve blue light detectors. And so that's a melanopsin receptor. A melanopsin receptor is a non-visual photoreceptor that we have in the retina of our eyes, but we also have it in our skin, which is really fascinating as well. So blue light entrains our circadian rhythms, and it's something that's programmed into our bodies since the beginning of life on Earth, essentially. And when blue light fades away at sunset and there's no more in the environment, that's what triggers the pituitary gland to be kind of switched off and the pineal gland to be switched on. So we're switching from cortisol levels being stimulated to melatonin to be produced. And melatonin production is really critical because any amount of blue light at night from an LED light bulb, from a fluorescent light bulb, or computer screens, TVs, that's really going to dampen the melatonin release in your body because you're sending an artificial signal through the eyes to your brain that it's noon again. So at noon, we would need higher blood sugar, more cortisol, more stress hormones. We would need to dampen melatonin because we would need activity for the day. So fixing circadian rhythm and blocking blue light at night is really important for many reasons, one of which being the melatonin aspect. And most people know of melatonin as an important sleep hormone, but it's also one of the most powerful antioxidants that our bodies have at their disposal. And they run two programs while you're sleeping at night. That's apoptosis and autophagy. Autophagy being cellular repair and kind of recycling of damaged cell components. So with any kind of disease or just being alive, that's really important. Cellular regeneration, staying young and fit. And then apoptosis, programmed cell death. So if there's a cell that is diseased beyond the point of repair, that cell needs to be cleaned up to allow space for new cells to be able to grow. And if we disrupt our melatonin stores with artificial blue light at night, we are enabling diseased cells to perpetuate in the body, which can contribute to tumor formation. And so this is the reason we see a correlation of impaired melatonin with increased risk for pretty much all cancers. Mm-hmm. So if you sleep is our best kind of restorative tool in our tool belt naturally. And if you're dealing with a chronic condition, fixing your sleep is really important and improving your melatonin levels naturally to be able to start restoring the body at night. And on melatonin as well, it also hints back to the importance of getting out in the morning because you build your melatonin stores by getting exposure to UVA light. UVA light, when it transmits through the eyes, interacts with tyrosine and dopamine, tyrosine and tryptophan. And tryptophan will then become serotonin. Serotonin later becomes melatonin. So by building those serotonin levels up, by activating that tryptophan in the morning with UVA light, you're able to increase your stores, and then those stores can be released at night to help you sleep if you block the blue light. So I think that, in training your circadian rhythm, really getting in sync with the rising and the setting of the sun is really important. Also, the fact that tyrosine becomes dopamine, tryptophan becomes serotonin, that means morning sunlight is also just going to make you feel better by improving the levels of your neurotransmitters. Serotonin being, your feel-good chemical, and dopamine being your reward chemical to give you motivation to keep going. So you also, by in training and getting up with the sun and falling with it, you tend to start developing more sense of clear-headedness and motivation to be able to keep going. And that can take a little bit of time, but I think I found that that's a common thread for a lot of people. So I think that, that's one big category of entrained circadian rhythms, fix those neurotransmitter production, fix your melatonin stores. And that's something that you can do in terms of controlling your environment. That's really important because when we get diagnosed with chronic diseases, most of the time we're just told there's nothing you can do about it. There's no explanation as to why you have this in the first place. So it can feel very helpless. But if I know how damaging LED lights, especially at night, can be, then I'm empowered with information. I can make some changes to my environment. And we know through the study of epigenetics that environmental triggers are what activate and turn on and off different genes to express bodies and symptoms in different ways. So replacing LED light bulbs with incandescents was something. And I think when I did that and I shifted the light environment in my own home, I think my nervous system just calmed down and I could feel it. And now when I've kind of reset the gauge, so to speak. And now when I have exposure to fluorescent lights, or if I take my blue blocker glasses off and look at the TV screen, it's so viscerally, painfully blue and stressful. And I have a really visceral reaction to these forms of artificial light now that I didn't have before. And I think that's just because as you heal and you kind of reset to what's natural, you become more sensitive to things that are not good for the human body.
Yes, 100%. Use the same thing too when you're not around non-native EMFs as much. And then all of a sudden you are, and you're like, oh, wow, this is really impacting me. So it's like you take that stressor away. You're like, oh, I'm feeling so much better. I feel so good. Da, da, da. And then you put that stressor back into the body. You're like, oh, this is what it was doing to me. Like, it's kind of scary. It's like, you don't, in a way, it's like I was exposing myself to that. But I mean, I was thinking this morning about how I used to be so photosensitive to the sun, but blue light never bothered me. And now it's the complete opposite. Now the sunlight is amazing. And I put on my blue blockers every time I'm around sun, even like during the day when I have to go to like Target or something like that, because it's honestly, those lights are like, especially in the middle of winter, like forget it. It's so much worse then than it is in summertime. But yeah, everything you said was so beautifully laid out, and you really explained that well, and the importance of melatonin in the body. But for your case, I would also say, dealing that you were struggling with so many pathogens, getting the mitochondria to make more exclusion zone water probably is the most important, like one of the most important things, because they're going to exclude the pathogens and push those out and build the redox. So I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit, because I think that probably was huge, right?
Sure. Yeah, layer 2 in the curriculum, exclusion zone water. So exclusion zone water, what is that? First of all, if you think of the liquid water, which is often referred to in the literature as bulk water that we drink or that we swim in, so those are H2O molecules that are constantly switching and changing in their bonds with each other in a disorganized fashion. And that's what keeps it liquid. In the body, when water aligns next to a hydrophilic surface or a water-loving surface, which is essentially any protein or membrane in the body, most of the surfaces in our body, it will reorganize its molecular structure into a lattice that's like an interconnected hexagonal lattice. And in that structure, not every single hydrogen atom is able to fit because the lattice is so tightly woven. And so they end up getting ejected into the neighboring liquid or bulk water. So what that does, because the oxygen atoms remain, is this exclusion zone that's building where the water is molecularly reorganizing, that ends up upholding a net negative charge, while the neighboring bulk or liquid water next to it ends up adopting a net positive charge. And what's fascinating about that is, what do we know about charge separation? We know that that creates a battery. And so, we know now from the works of people like Professor Gerald Pollack, that he's done these experiments and even put in electrodes into the negative and positive water there and able to light a light bulb. So we know that this creates electrical potential or charge in the body. And it seems to be that this water's ability to create charge separation seems to be what fuels life at the cell and below cell level. And previously, we always considered ATP as kind of the cellular energy currency. Now, most of the evidence that we're looking at suggests that while ATP is very important, it seems to be more of an ability for there to be the creation of more exclusion zone water around it to be able to increase this charge in the first place. So your mitochondria, coming back to the importance you laid out of how important they are for our body, how do we produce energy? How do we metabolize our food? That's all done through the mitochondria. And the mitochondria are ancient organisms that are symbiotic life forms. They are organelles inside of our cells, and they have something called an electron transport chain, which is a series of 5 protein complexes laid out. And they funnel electrons that are broken down from food. So every time we're eating, what we're essentially doing is we're breaking down the food into the electrons that we can use to funnel through our mitochondria to produce energy. And so fats have the most electrons, proteins second most, and carbohydrates have the least, about half as much. So when we metabolize those foods, break them down, the electrons are freed, they're funneled through this electron transport chain in the mitochondria. And in complex 4, which is called cytochrome C oxidase, that's where metabolic water is created. And previously, in the textbooks, you would always read that this was just a byproduct. But what I love about quantum biology is that we know that nature never makes mistakes. This is not a byproduct this is mostly the essential feature of what it's doing for us in hydrating our bodies and creating the charge that we need. So in doing that, and then ATP and the fifth cytochrome, that's how we create our energy. And when the mitochondria are producing this water, it's also deuterium depleted water, which we can speak about deuterium next, if you like, to create more of this exclusion zone water, more of this battery. And when the cell is filled with exclusion zone water and exclusion zone water around it, if this network is so tightly woven as a liquid crystal that it excludes all impurities. We can think of it like a crystal because as crystals form, the molecular structure that's so repeating and tightly woven, it excludes any kind of impurities, right? And so ice does the same thing. This exclusion zone water in our bodies does the same thing, and nothing larger than essentially a proton is able to pass through when it's in that form. So essentially, you have like a impenetrable barrier. You can think of it like some sort of Star Wars force field around the cell that intracellular pathogens would not be able to penetrate through, or heavy metals, for example, would not be able to penetrate through. So you're able to really protect the cell from that type of damage, and then those things can then be dealt with by the immune system and excreted, whether that's in the bile or urine, what have you, and taken out of the body. So building up your exclusion zone water is really important.
Right. So basically, Tim, like what I want the listeners to understand that means if you had strong mitochondria and the mitochondria are making a lot of exclusion zone water, Lyme disease is really not possible to happen in your body, basically. Right. Do you agree with that statement? It's almost like it can't happen, right? Because they can't, like, that's my thinking. Like, you're not going to get those things into the cell, right? Do you agree?
I'm not sure. I think that Lyme particularly requires so much nuance. It means that you're going to recover so much faster. It means that if you have high redox potential, if you have a lot of charged exclusion zone water in your body, and you were bit by a tick, you may not express symptoms of the disease.
Yeah.
But so you're able to protect yourself from being able to get manifestation of disease. You're able to recover faster. However, if you're somebody who has low redox potential, who has poor metabolic function, poor mitochondrial health, and you're already getting this disease, then it can be very tricky. And there's a lot of aspects of Lyme, particularly, that are difficult because that exclusion zone water is also constantly going through phase changes and, has different capabilities of opening up and allowing things, micronutrients to be able to funnel through into the cell. So there's possibilities for things to get in, I believe. We don't really know exactly how strong of an impenetrable barrier is this, if it's going through these phase changes and whatnot. But what we do know clearly is that recovery and protection, those kind of ends of things, are going to be greatly improved. But I don't know if I would go so far as to say that it will just protect you all out, especially if you have poor mitochondrial health in the first place. It's going to be difficult.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. That makes a lot of sense. I like the way you said that. That's true. Definitely is going to be supportive, though. 100%.
Yeah. And I think that this is another reason why non-native EMFs were so difficult, especially in my case, is that we know now that non-native electromagnetic frequencies, and I guess I'll break down what that means. Light is radiation. Light is electromagnetic energy, right? And so we evolved on planet Earth under a natural spectrum of electromagnetic energy that includes invisible infrared light from the sun, the visible spectrum of light that we see, which is the color of the rainbow, and then invisible ultraviolet light, and then some amount of radio frequencies and things like that. And the Earth is protected. We're protected on the Earth by the magnetosphere from anything outside of this range of electromagnetic radiation under which we evolved. And so when we send astronauts up into space, we have seen that they become very dehydrated, that disease progresses very, very quickly, and their health really suffers from that. And they're exposed to a lot larger degree of non-native EMF because they're no longer protected by the Earth's magnetosphere. So essentially what we're doing when we produce a lot of non-native EMF, which is, our cell service, our Wi-Fi, our wireless devices that are in the radio frequency and microwave range of electromagnetic radiation, we're creating an alien environment for which we are not adapted because we did not evolve in those type of environmental circumstances. And so to think that we can make such huge, drastic environmental changes and not have biological consequences is a little bit naive. And so we are learning now the ways in which this does impact biology, and there's several different ways. Number one, in no particular order, but non-native EMFs interact with the voltage-gated calcium channels on our cells that are constantly opening and closing to allow calcium to be drawn into the cell. And non-native EMFs essentially force them to be stuck open. And what that does is it allows the excess calcium to be, it's called calcium efflux, excess calcium to be drawn into the cell. And that's usually sequestered up, I believe, by the endoplasmic reticulum, which is another organelle inside the cell. But it's so much that the mitochondria end up having to stop their primary functions of creating metabolic water and ATP for our energy. They have to stop doing that and to help sequester all the excess calcium. So you've created mitochondrial dysfunction. You're going to have less energy. You're going to have less metabolic water, less exclusion zone water, so less cellular protection in exposure to non-native EMF because of that. And calcium is also positively charged. So you're also dealing with the acidity and alkalinity, the pH of the cell, and it's creating positive charge correlates with acidity, acidic environment, and negative with an alkaline environment. And the cell needs to operate with a net negative charge on in the interior. So we're also just disrupting that and creating conditions for cellular dysfunction and disease. So that's one way that non-native EMFs kind of affect our biology. And that's why it's also so dehydrating. If we're working in an office all day long, using Wi-Fi all day long, we're not able to produce as much metabolic water. So we're not able to create as much charge separated exclusion zone water. Another way that non-native EMFs negatively affect us is they actually collapse the exclusion zone water. I believe it by about 15% is what Gerald Pollack's studies found. So we're literally losing charge. And one thing I didn't mention about exclusion zone water is it's a reservoir for electrons. So if we're grounding and we are physically touching the Earth's surface, the reason why that works is that any two conductive surfaces, when they touch, electrons will flow from the area of greatest concentration to the area of least concentration, or that has more positive charge. And so that's why the Earth is a huge repository of electrons due to solar radiation and lightning strikes. Those electrons flow instantly through our body, as long as we're not wearing rubber-soled shoes or things of that nature. And electrons essentially get stored up in the exclusion zone networks of our body. And what's cool about that is normally electrons would be kind of orbiting specific molecules. But because the water molecules reorganize into this interconnected lattice throughout the body, those electrons now no longer belong just to an individual water molecule. They now belong to the network as a whole, which means that they can quantumly instantaneously travel to wherever they're most needed throughout the body. So essentially wherever there's most inflammation, because we know that electrons act as antioxidants, fixing free radicals by donating themselves to molecules that are lacking a balanced pair of electrons and are going around kind of creating fires in the body, so reducing that. So it's really important to have that type of hydration for that reason, and that's another way that non-native EMF, by disrupting that in the body, is very damaging in excess.
Yeah.
So people
Go ahead.
deal with the tech issue. I know. So I just moved and I had set up all my cables and everything. And tripping over them, like it's okay. I'd rather have that than contribute to ill health by basically radiating myself 24/7. So it's been a journey with that for me, having had the iWatch or whatever it's called, the Apple Watch years ago, and I'm like, nope, selling it. Those earpods or whatever they're called, sold got rid. I think they're in a drawer somewhere. I'm like, I want to throw them away, but getting
Yeah.
rid of all of these things that people don't realize are really hurting their bodies, even if it's not an immediate impact, it's this gradual weakening, I think, right? And like you said, depleting our body of electrons. So, Tim, I'm just wondering if you could share with us, like in your perspective, how much do you think the allopathic and alternative helped you heal? Like what percentage wise? And then when you added quantum in, like how much did that move the needle? And then if you could give us an overview of what your current practices are, like how do you embrace these quantum principles today?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I'd probably say it's really hard to say because we don't consciously know all the things that have really moved the needle. But it seems to me like I could somewhat safely say that 80% has been through adopting these kind of quantum principles and applications. It's possible that the antibiotics and treatment protocols that I went through also did help. Um, at the same time, I don't know how much, and I don't know how much maybe they also potentially could have set me back by really destroying my immune system and my gut.
Yeah.
So who knows? But and that's another thing with everybody with Lyme. It really needs to be a case by case basis, because of the severity of the condition. If people just get Lyme meaning just the Borrelia burgdorferi bacteria, in most cases, that's not going to express any kind of symptoms of disease. And in fact, many Lyme literate physicians believe that it's essentially ubiquitous, that most of the population has exposure now to Lyme bacteria. Doesn't spread just solely through a tick bite. There are other vectors that it can spread, and it can also be spread congenitally. But it's really the co-infections, the mix of pathogens that you can get that can create massive complications. And tick is basically nature's dirty needle. So if you're bit by one and it infects you with Lyme, you could potentially get Babesia or Bartonella, Mycoplasma, a huge array of different forms of bacteria, viruses, parasites, pathogens. And depending on each individual's mix that they're getting, their symptoms are going to vary greatly. So there's no one treatment with Lyme because there's no one such thing as Lyme disease. It is different for every single person. And so that's why, if there's anybody dealing with Lyme or chronic issues, I would really stress the importance of quantum biology applications because it provides your body with the necessary biophysical foundations for regeneration. At the same time, it is likely in many cases that people may need herbal treatments or even pharmaceutical treatments in some cases, because there are some tick-borne pathogens that can kill you very quickly, actually, such as Possum virus. So it really varies. And so a lot of times when we talk about Lyme, we have to be careful not to speak in really broad terms or kind of apply any blanket statements. So in my case, I had a number of co-infections. Those previous treatments did not kill those pathogens off because when I tested, they were all still there. And recently I just tested my babesiosis did not show up.
Yeah,
So
that's awesome.
that's looking good. And then what was the second part of your question beyond the
Like, what is your protocol today? Like, how are you, what does your day look like, basically? How do you keep yourself healthy?
I try to get up with the sunrise, which is something that a couple years ago when I was really sick, you could never catch me doing, just because I could not physically get up. I had such extreme fatigue. I couldn't open my eyes. My body felt so heavy. And it was really hard for me to get up in the mornings. And so now it's pretty wild for me to experience what it's like for my body to be waking up naturally so early. I don't catch the sunrise every single day, but I try to not stress myself out about that, but just be consistent and be directionally accurate. You know, we only get, what is it, 25,000 sunrises in our whole lives. How many of those do I really want to miss? So I try to catch that. That sets the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain. That kind of sets the master clock in the brain so that it can manage all of the body's peripheral clocks. And when it comes to our circadian biology, the liver, the pancreas, lungs, heart, they all have these peripheral clocks in order to regulate their activities, to know when they need to be active and when they need to switch off for regeneration. So if we're messing with our circadian clock and they don't know where they are in time, they can't cohesively work together. And that on point of circadian biology, I really like the analogy of the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain that takes in the light information and distributes it throughout the body is really like the conductor of the orchestra, which is what we say all the time. But it's really true, because if you have a lot of noise in the body, there's not going to be any kind of coherent sound out of that. That's a melody or a song. And so how do we get all these many noises and notes to come together in a coherent fashion to create a song and a coherent melody that can play out? They all have to be coupled to the same sense of time. And so getting up and seeing the sunrise resets that master clock in your brain and allows it to distribute that information through the body so that all the body's many different systems and instruments can be coupled to the same sense of time and they can work together cohesively. And when we have confused light signals in our day or disrupted circadian rhythms, we start losing that coherence, and that's what manifests as inflammation in the body. So number one is seeing sunrise. Number two is UVA rise. So in the morning, it's mostly wavelengths of blue and red. And then UVA rise, which is when the sun has risen about 10 degrees above the horizon. That's what we talked about before, where UVA has the ability to transform aromatic amino acids inside the retina into neurotransmitters. So I think that that's really important in terms of just rebuilding some of your mental motivation and mental health as well. And then getting at least a minimum of like 30 minutes exposures to UVB. So when the sun is at its zenith. And that's really important because that's when we are able to produce or synthesize vitamin D. And we know that that's really important for the immune system as well. And then finally, blocking artificial blue light at night. So I will always put on, if I'm on the computer and have to work for a lot of time, or like you said, when you go into a store or Walmart or something, you would put on some blue blockers. I'll wear these yellow ones during the daytime because they just block about half the amount of blue. You don't want to limit all blue during the day because you don't want to be sleepy. But after sunset, I put on orange ones, and that blocks the blue frequencies from disrupting the melatonin release and allowing me to rest and get to bed earlier. And you'll find when you start adopting that kind of cycle, your clock will start shifting bit by bit to be able to sleep earlier and to be able to get up earlier. And it takes consistency, but you will notice your internal biological clock shifting. So that's kind of how I work through my day. I also take steps. I changed my light environment in my home. So I swapped out LED light bulbs in all the lamps with incandescents. The LEDs have a higher flicker rate as well, which is very stress inducing, kind of activates the sympathetic nervous system, which you can usually see if you take your phone on slow motion camera mode and take a video and then play it back. You'll see the light is flashing like crazy. So in addition to the artificial spike in blue that lacks infrared from LEDs, we also have that high flicker rate that's very stress inducing. And a note on the blue light, in nature, blue is never present without being balanced by red and infrared. So what we've done with our LEDs, our light emitting diode technology, is we've isolated specific frequencies of light and left out others. And when we mess with nature's formula like that, there will be consequences. Because blue is this stress-inducing, stimulating effect, and red and infrared are restorative to the body that balance really matters, and we don't have that with our LEDs. So unfortunately, in the US and other countries, incandescent light bulbs are being phased out because they're being seen as energy inefficient. And why is that? That's because they give off heat. Well, that heat is the infrared light. So that's what's charging. And infrared light is incredibly important because it charges and expands that exclusion zone water network in the body that we talked about before. And it's very restorative. And that's the kind of basis behind photobiomodulation or red light therapy that we see. So in the house, being able to do that, which is an easy fix, if you can still get some incandescence, it may be a good idea. And just being conscious of, rather than having overhead lights on at night, keeping just like floor level lamps on or something of that nature. You know, if I'm in a car and I'm driving, I'll crack the window open. If I'm in a building, I'll crack the window open, allow some of that full spectrum sunlight to come in, because windows as well will block about half the red and infrared, and let in a mostly predominantly blue lit environment as well. So these are kind of light environment changes that you can make as well to your home. And I found for me, it really did help. And kind of for me, what I noticed the most from doing that was the nervous system regulation. Because
Yes.
Lyme disease kind of hijacks your brain to stimulate sympathetic nervous system response all the time. And the lights are doing that to you too. So it's very calming and comforting. And I found that some of the brain fog as well, when I wear the yellow blue blockers, is mitigated when working on the computer.
What are some of your favorite light bulbs? Do you just use like an Edison style, or do you like some from different companies like Midwest Red Light Therapy, or which ones do you prefer?
I do have one red light bulb from Midwest. I'll use that at night in my room if I'm reading or something. For the daytime, I have the Edison style. And I just like aesthetically like the look of those as well.
They're so soothing. Like it really is so amazing. Like people talk a lot about nervous system health, and it really is like all of these practices and principles do really, really calm the nervous system a lot. Like it's huge, actually. So like I wish when people talked about that, they would, I mean, of course, there's more to it. Like I could say that 100%. There's other things we need to do possibly too to heal trauma and other things that are going on if you have that kind of dysregulation. But these simple things really do make a huge impact on the nervous system. I felt that same thing. You just feel calm. I used to be such a night owl. I had so much energy at night. I mean, literally, I would stay up till midnight and then get up at 5 a.m. to do my fasted workouts. And when I started mitigating blue light at night, I was falling asleep by like 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night. And I went to red glasses. That I did need the red, like it depends on the person, but that really was supportive for me. Like it was like, wow. I mean, I was tired and I still am tired now to this day, literally it's like 8:30, 9 o'clock. I'm like, okay, guys, I'm good now. I'm ready for bed.
Definitely. Yeah, I have a hard time staying up like beyond 9 o'clock most of the time now.
It's so true, right? Like, yeah, it's crazy. So yeah, it's amazing. Tim, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to chat about? Like, is there anything that you were like specifically want to chat about Lyme, that we didn't mention yet?
Yeah, so with Lyme, I would differentiate Lyme as this bacteria that we've identified that's called Borrelia burgdorferi, and there's many different Borrelia subspecies as well. So there's that, and then there's Lyme disease complex is really the most accurate term. And that's because I mentioned of the multitude of co-infections that people can get. So in many cases, it's a bit of a Russian doll syndrome. When you're treating Lyme disease complex, there may be one pathogen, maybe that's Borrelia Lyme, or maybe that's Babesia, the malaria-like parasite. It may be kind of at the forefront and causing your existing symptoms at the moment. And then when that starts getting treated and taken care of, others will come to the surface. And they kind of flip-flop and cycle in this way. So Russian doll in terms of if you treat one, another is released, treat one, another is released. And that can lead to confusion amongst the patients because their symptoms are constantly shifting. But that's because there's a kind of main bad guy, if you want to say, and they're not bad guys, right? They're all part of nature. But main one coming to the fore and causing that symptomology. So Bartonella might cause more psychiatric symptoms, whereas, Babesia may cause a lot of air hunger, and Lyme can cause anything from neurological issues to heart complications to arthritis. So it really depends on the individual. When it comes to Lyme disease, I would also just make the note that for a lot of people, mold is also an issue because those are both emitting biotoxins. And Lyme disease, and mold both emit biotoxins. And what that does is those get stored in the fat cells in our body. And that kind of hijacks them to release an excess of inflammatory cytokines. And when you have chronically elevated cytokine levels, that will lead to chronically elevated leptin levels, leptin being a master hormone that's responsible for your feeling of satiety, feeling satisfied after eating. Your cells, as they absorb more lipids and fats, will release more leptin. And then at night, it's a circadian hormone. Leptin levels will dock to the hypothalamus in the brain and just tell your body how much stored energy you have on hand so that it knows, well, do I have enough energy for essentially, if I'm a woman, for reproduction to be able to carry a baby, or, or do I need to kind of go into starvation mode because there's not enough resources in the external environment? So leptin is this master hormone that's regulating all of that. And there's a lot of downstream hormones like insulin. So most of the time, if you've become insulin resistant, you've already become leptin resistant first. So even if you follow a healthy diet, Lyme or biotoxin illness can kind of hijack your system to create chronically elevated leptin levels. And then the leptin receptors in your brain get damaged, so they can't tell how much leptin is circulating in the body anymore. And that's akin to driving a vehicle with a broken fuel gauge. And so you keep stopping to get gas and fill up because you're worried you're going to run out. So the body basically thinks it's in a starvation mode, and it's going to want to hold on to fat and insulin and all of this instead of allowing you to burn it for energy. So it can kind of create this cascade of hormonal problems in that way. And then when you have chronically elevated leptin levels, it's going to coincide with chronically lowered alpha MSH, alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone. So this is the hormone that's responsible for our ability to produce a tan because it creates melanin. And so melanin, has this amazing efficacy, 99.9% efficacy of transforming ultraviolet light into harmless heat. So it's the best form of sunscreen we could possibly have. We know that melanin is also a superconductor of electrons. So it provides fuel and energy to the cells as well. And that's why in cases of Parkinson's, you see a loss of melanin in the substantia nigra of the brain. So melanin rejuvenation is really important. But alpha MSH is involved with a lot more than that. It's involved with appetite regulation. It's involved with pain signaling and your endogenous opioid production. So then you can end up experiencing things like fibromyalgia because you are just constantly feeling pain because your body's ability to produce these endogenous opioids essentially is not working. So that's kind of a Lyme cascade of biotoxins. And many times in the Lyme world, a focus on detox is really important because you start treating and start experiencing these Herxheimer's reactions. If you had high enough redox potential and open enough drainage pathways, you probably wouldn't experience that so much. So they talk about detoxing a lot and suggest things like activated charcoal, zeolite clay, chlorella. These are all binders that can bind to toxins and help eliminate out of the body so that they don't just constantly recirculate. However, all of those binders are negatively charged. So they're going to have efficacy predominantly in binding to positively charged toxins. That would be your heavy metals, pesticides, things of that nature. But Lyme and mold biotoxins are negatively charged. So a negatively charged binder trying to bind to a negatively charged toxin isn't really going to work. It may work a little bit in some cases where just the molecular structure is able to kind of capture things. But for the most part, it might just be kind of shifting things around in the body. So some people may need to, if they have really elevated mycotoxin levels, may need to show these lab results to a doctor, and it might need a prescription for something like cholestyramine, which is typically used as a cholesterol medication, but it is a positively charged, very effective binder for biotoxins. And so I think that's where it's really important for people with complex disease cases like this to work hand in hand. Your day-to-day life should really be based in these quantum biology fundamentals because you will start feeling better. You can have hope again because it's just evolutionary conditions that we need to regenerate. But it's important to walk hand in hand with other practices as needed, and allopathic medicine in certain cases, to be able to get the support that you need.
And does the high potency methylene blue or the holy hydrogen type of things, are they supportive for Lyme?
Yeah, I was also thinking of the Takasumi Takasumi as another binder. What about that one too? Do you ever have any experience with any of that?
Yeah, Takasumi is my favorite form of activated charcoal, just because it has
Yeah.
those properties of like increasing the amount of infrared light in the body somehow. And it has a lot of interesting aspects that make it a great form. So it is still effective. A lot of people who develop, especially things like parasites in the body, it oftentimes is because they already have exposure to heavy metals and other things that have weakened their system and lowered their charge, and create an environment that is favorable to these pathogens to be able to come in. And for things like parasites, in some cases, it looks like they have kind of an advantageous role in the body of sequestering heavy metals.
Even
So
deuterium, actually, as well. I've heard that parasites actually help remove deuterium from the body. So, like when people go and do those parasite cleanse, I pose the question to, well, maybe that's not what you should be doing right now, because maybe they're doing something important for your body. Like if they're eating heavy metals and deuterium, well, like
right. Then if you have a mindset of kill, 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 you're
right.
re-releasing everything that's a pathogen for them in their bodies into your body again. So it's all about kind of having more of an ecosystem view,
Yeah.
a thriving, diverse, balanced ecosystem, rather than this is a bad guy, must kill, kill, kill. But in some cases, I'm also against the idea that you just don't need to kill Lyme or pathogens, because that's very dangerous. Many people may not need to take that route of taking any kind of herbs, or methylene blue is also very helpful, like you mentioned, with things like Babesia. Because Babesia infects the red blood cells and creates a hypoxic environment, and methylene blue is able to help fix and mitigate that. So methylene blue is often used for Lyme in some people. But yeah, just it really, with Lyme, it's important to sit down with the individual and see what their case is, their environment, their infections, to see what can best be used. And we also may not be dealing with something that's totally natural to nature. Lyme disease, the first cases of Lyme disease occurred early in the 1970s in Lyme, Connecticut. That's why it's named Lyme. And that was just offshore from the Plum Island Animal Disease Biological Lab, which had experienced a number of different leaks in its history. You can read about that in a book called Lab 257. There's also another great book about it in a book called Bitten. And so we know that in the context of coming out of World War II and nuclear deterrence, that there was an impetus for advancing our understanding of biological weapons from a defensive perspective, but also from an offensive perspective. So after World War I, that offensive weapons program continued on until Nixon eventually got rid of it, which is kind of maybe the one great thing he did or was forced to do. But we know that the person who identified Lyme as the causative agent of the disease, so in Lyme, Connecticut, all of a sudden people started getting conditions of arthritis and these disease symptoms that exploded out of nowhere. Babesia exploded out of nowhere near the lab as well. So the top researcher, who was a Swiss researcher named Willy Bergdorfer, he was working in the Rocky Mountain lab. I believe it's in Montana at the time. He was called in because he was kind of the world expert, or at least the US expert in tick-borne diseases, to identify what might be going on. He's the one who identified the spirochete bacteria in these patients. So it was named after him, Borrelia burgdorferi. He also mentioned at the time the presence of another pathogen that he named the Swiss agent in many, if not most, of these patients. And it was a pathogen called Rickettsia helvetica. And so what's interesting is that the kind of scientific exploration of the Swiss agent never continued on. And that was pretty much silenced and eliminated, that part of the story. And kind of the whole focus moved forward on the spirochete, Lyme. So that's interesting. And we don't really know the answers of, like, well, the Swiss agent, does that have pathogenic pathogenic implications in this as well, complicating issues. We don't know actually. And what's interesting about Willy Burgdorfer's career is he was tasked with taking ticks and trying to increase the amount of pathogens that were inside of them. Because if you think about it from a biological weapon standpoint, being able to airdrop ticks on a population that are infected with disease agents, if you have a number of different disease agents inside that tick, then it will make diagnosis of what's happening to the population very difficult, because the standard symptoms that are associated with those tick-borne illnesses wouldn't be manifesting because you have this slew of things going on. So it would be able to spread and kind of confuse and slowly burn out society because you're slowly disrupting society with chronic illness. That's pretty much impossible to diagnose at the time. So that was the thinking behind it at the time. And so they would even make the ticks radioactive and release them to be able to track them. So if they had radioactive isotopes, you would be able to use a Geiger counter to be able to track their movements. And that would be important because if there was, for offensive or defensive capabilities, if somebody were to airdrop infected ticks, we want to know, well, what's the circumference or the radius that they can travel to be able to infect. So all of these experiments were happening. We do not know how natural or unnatural the spread of today's version of Lyme disease is. And so I think, this is where the origins of Lyme are very controversial. This is not saying that Lyme is the result of biological weapons, but it's saying, well, but we were doing this research. We know that these tests occurred. We know that a number of different Lyme tick-borne illnesses happened to occur suddenly out of nowhere in many different tick pathogens that weren't even endemic to the US, just outside of the Plum Island Animal Disease Facility, which had a history of different issues. So it doesn't look good, but
No,
what
it
we really
doesn't.
need is
That
explanation.
sounds like bioterrorism to me. Sounds familiar too.
It does sound really familiar, and I didn't never heard this
Unfortunately.
story, and as well as you just laid it out.
Before we started, before Tim came on, this is what I was talking about, Vanessa.
I know. Now I'm like, oh, I love the way you laid it out and explained it, because I'm like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it's
And this goes back to why I'm so cautious to say that, well, if you have Lyme, you can just focus on some of these health fundamentals and not focus on killing it. Well, the Lyme bacteria has existed for tens of thousands of years at least. There was that mummy, I think his name was Otzi, that they found had the spirochete bacteria Lyme Borrelia burgdorferi in it. So we know that this has been around and infecting people for a long, long time. The pathogen is not new. However, Otzi was killed. He was murdered, I think through a spear through his chest or something of that nature. So it likely was not causing the manifestation of disease. So essentially what we have here is what's going on. Why are things that were part of the natural environment suddenly manifesting as disease in us? And I think that there's a number of things. One, we may be dealing in some cases with versions of a Lyme disease complex that did not naturally evolve in this way. And so you might need some extra supportive capabilities. At the same time, our environment is just so much more toxic. We are exposed to glyphosate and chemical toxins, and essentially all of our health buckets are getting filled up. And maybe if somebody's bucket, you don't start experiencing symptoms of disease until that bucket starts spilling over. And so for a lot of Lyme patients, maybe they already had mold mycotoxin exposure, glyphosate, all of these things, and then Lyme, and then the buckets just started spilling over. So there's just so many more environmental factors at play here too. But I would say, without going into conspiracy theory land, but without also just blatantly denying the facts that are there, it's important that we need answers. And this is something from a congressional level that we should all be asking for, because our children and our children's children are being affected by this. And it really, Lyme and Lyme disease complex really is a quiet, hidden epidemic. It took a long time. At first, the CDC would just say there's only about 30,000 new cases a year. everybody who had Lyme knew that this is completely not true. And over time, they were kind of forced to admit, well, actually, it's about 500,000 a year. And we know that 10 to 20% of all of those people will end up developing chronic and sometimes debilitating symptoms. So for sometimes when people talk about Lyme as, oh, it's not such a big deal. Well, for many people, yeah, it may not be. But if you're part of this 10 to 20%, and if you have a mix of these different cofactors that can really complicate things, it can absolutely ruin and destroy your life. Financially destroying entire families because of the tens of thousands of dollars of treatment, the confusion. And there's also no clear guidelines on how to test and how to treat this disease. There's a bit of a Lyme war in between two leading factions. One is the IDSA, which is the board that sets the regulatory standards for testing and treatment guidelines. And then you have groups of doctors, physicians who do not agree with those standards, and they're part of ILADS, ILADS. And so they're known as Lyme literate physicians. And if people are looking for a more Lyme literate physician, they can go to ILADS website to look up people in their area. But they essentially, ILADS does not believe, like the IDSA does, that a short bout of antibiotics will just cure the disease. Because so many people continue to experience debilitating symptoms, and they're just gaslit saying that, that doesn't exist. And I think that for me, probably the most damaging part of the disease and the decades that I experienced it was the constant gaslighting and the kind of feeling of complete isolation from society that you end up feeling when you're dealing with a unexplainable chronic illness. So it's difficult for patients to navigate. Do I trust ILADS? Do I trust the IDSA? However, we know that this is also a centralized system, that any centralized system is vulnerable to corruption via single points of failure. This is why decentralized systems are more resilient over time and uncorruptible. And why I also love quantum biology. It's more of a decentralized model. It's why I love Bitcoin as a decentralized model, all of these things. But the IDSA is kind of caught up in all of these controversial claims as well, because we know that the testing guidelines that they have are so ineffective. And why are we not updating those so that people can get better answers when we have the science to be able to do so? Well, it's because members of the board are the existing holders of the existing patents for the testing mechanism. So there's no economic incentive for them to advance things to help patients, and it's held captive. So there's Lyme is a political, economic, just mess of a situation that I hope people can develop a little bit more empathy for, just kind of in the public discourse. And it may be something that's really hard to perceive or understand until it happens to you. Or until it happens to somebody close in your family, and then you see how real it is, and then you get mad as hell. Mad as hell because these things are going on and we're not having the political change to do anything about it. And that's frustrating.
When any becomes involved, then the whole thing changes. So it's interesting, Tim, how your background in medical disinformation obviously served you well. Unfortunately, that came in handy. But I think what I'm hearing, there's so much interesting information around Lyme that it's very complicated. Yes, it's very political. There's a lot of, factors involved. But especially what I'm hearing is that somebody like yourself would be the best person to help those who are seeking some kind of, I don't know the right word, but real help, if you will, right? You've been through it. You have the quantum lens, all the different aspects of it, all the angles, and you can help guide them. So do you do like a complete assessment when people come in, and how can people contact you as we're getting ready to wrap up here? I want to make sure that people know about you and your services.
Sure, great. Thank you for that opportunity. That's my hope. That's why I'm excited to kind of shift my career focus, 10 years of doing something completely different into this. It kind of creates purpose behind all of it, and it helps me resonate with the feeling of gratitude as well, because I've learned so much information and I do find it also fascinating. So if people have Lyme or Lyme related or an illness or any kind of chronic illness, they can reach out to me at timhammond@regenerant.com. My company is called Regenerant because that stands for regenerative intelligence. They can also visit my website, which is regenerant.com, REGENERINT, and contact me through there. And I'd be happy to do an assessment and talk and see if I'm the right person. If I'm not, maybe I can help refer to other people who may be. But yeah, really, I just want to help people because for many years, I was just reading these online forums for Lyme community, which is important so they don't feel so isolated, but it also can just become the most hopeless, desolate of places. So to be able to offer some hope and guidance, I really want to do that for people.
Yeah, I think you're an amazing asset to not only to the Lyme community, but just to chronic illness community in general. You can help so many people. So you shared so much amazing information today, just about what we need to do to heal, your story, such an inspirational story as well. It was just really enjoyed the conversation, Tim. And we thank you so much for coming on the show. And just, I know you're going to help so many people in the future. I think it's really going to be a really great thing that you're doing. So it's amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's an honor I love your podcast. You have so many great guests. So it's really an honor. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, you're welcome.